On April 5th of this year, with roughly 11 million barrels per day locked behind a closed strait, OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, announced it would increase production by 206,000 barrels per day. 206,000 against 11 million. That is less than 2% of the supply the world had just lost. But OPEC issued a statement anyway, referencing market stability and collective commitment, as though the committee room and the Persian Gulf were operating in the same reality. They were not. This is not the first time that gap has opened up. In January of 1979, Iranian oil workers walked off the job. 37,000 of them struck the nationalized refineries. In November of 1978, dropping Iran's output from roughly 6 million barrels per day to about 1.5 million almost overnight. By December, Iranian exports had essentially stopped. The Shah left the country in January. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from Paris in February, and the Islamic Republic was declared. The wells did not physically stop working. The political and human infrastructure around them did. Iran had been producing close to 6 million barrels per day. Within weeks, that number was near zero. Saudi Arabia and other OPEC members ramped up to partially cover the gap. Saudi Arabia pushed toward 9 million barrels per day, then higher. The net global supply loss, after those offsets, was somewhere between 4 and 5% of world production. Prices doubled within a year. Not because the arithmetic demanded it. At 4 to 5% net loss, you could model a price increase, but not what actually happened. What happened was fear. Buyers did not just purchase what they needed, they stockpiled, they hoarded, they assumed the worst about what was coming next. The Brookings Institution later described it plainly. Panic buying deepened the shortage beyond the physical reality of barrels lost. OPEC held a ministerial meeting in Caracas in December of 1979, and the Washington Post described it as a deadlock. Saudi Arabia's oil minister, Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, refused to discuss joint production ceilings. Iran's new oil minister, Ali Akbar Moinfar, was threatening to drop prices, or as he put it, drop the oil. The cartel was fractured while prices were rising fast. From $13 to $15 a barrel in mid-1979 to $34 by mid-1980, to a nominal peak of $39.50 in 1981, roughly $175 in today's money. The crisis did not resolve at a meeting table. It resolved over years. World oil demand fell 10% between 1979 and 1983. Non-OPEC producers, the North Sea, Alaska, Siberia, added 5.5 million barrels per day between 1979 and 1985. Industries and utilities switched to coal and natural gas. Cars became more fuel efficient. OPEC's market share fell from 50% in 1979 to 29% in 1985. And in 1986, after Saudi Arabia abandoned its swing producer role and flooded the market in frustration at quota cheaters, prices collapsed to $12 a barrel. That is 1979, a supply disruption driven by Iranian political upheaval. OPEC policy statements running alongside a crisis the cartel could not control. Saudi Arabia attempting to compensate. Prices doubling. A multi-year resolution through demand destruction and supply diversification, and an eventual collapse in OPEC's institutional authority. On February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury, targeting military sites, nuclear facilities, and leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. Iran retaliated with missile and drone attacks and deployed the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to block the Strait of Hormuz with drones, missiles, small attack boats, and sea mines. By March 2nd, the IRGC had officially declared the strait closed, Brent crude crossed $100 on March 8th. By March 19th, Dubai crude hit a record high of $166 per barrel. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of globally traded oil and 20% of global liquefied natural gas, somewhere between 17 and 21 million barrels per day before the closure. Saudi Arabia has a bypass pipeline. The UAE has another. Together, they cover about 6.5 million barrels per day. That leaves more than 2/3 of normal straight throughput with nowhere to go. By May of this year, the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, was assessing production shut-ins at 11.3 million barrels per day. Rystad Energy estimated a peak of 11.7 million barrels per day in early June. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, described more than 14 million barrels per day below pre-war levels when combining shut-in production with rerouted losses, and characterized it as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. OPEC's own production has fallen more than 30% since the war began. Global inventories fell 129 million barrels in March alone, and another 117 million in April. Against all of that, OPEC announced increases of 206,000 barrels per day in March, 206,000 again in April, and 188,000 for June. Rystad's Senior Vice President for Geopolitical Analysis, Jorge Leon, said plainly, markets are more concerned with whether barrels can move than with spare capacity on paper. If flows through the Gulf are constrained, additional production will provide limited immediate relief. That is the honest version of what OPEC was saying. What OPEC was actually saying was that it was committed to market stability. The countries making those production pledges could not physically export the oil. This is where the parallel to 1979 holds. In both cases, OPEC issued formal policy responses, production announcements, stability statements, ministerial communiques, while the supply emergency outside the meeting room operated on a different scale entirely. In 1979, the cartel's policy machinery ran alongside a political collapse it could not control. In 2026, it ran alongside a military conflict and strait closure it could not control. In both cases, the numbers in the press release had no meaningful relationship to the numbers in the physical market, and in both cases, fear and uncertainty amplified what the raw arithmetic would have predicted. But the 1979 parallel breaks down in ways that matter. The scale is not comparable. The 1979 crisis involved a net global supply loss of 4 to 5% after offsets. The 2026 disruption peaked at over 11% of global supply by the EIA's own count, with some measures higher. The IEA has not described this as comparable to 1979. It has described it as surpassing 1973 and 1979 combined in severity. The mechanism of disruption is also different. In 1979, Iranian production collapsed because the human and political infrastructure around the wells was destroyed. In 2026, a substantial portion of Gulf production has been shut in not because the wells stopped working, but because tankers cannot transit and onshore storage filled up. That distinction matters for recovery dynamics. In theory, once the strait reopens, production could return faster in 2026 than Iranian production did after the revolution, though the EIA's current projection of full supply restoration not until early 2027 suggests that theory has not translated into a clean timetable. The pre-crisis context runs almost opposite to 1979 as well. The world entered 1979 with roughly 4 to 5 billion barrels in global oil stocks, near all-time highs, which initially cushioned the price impact. The world entered 2026 after the largest annual stock build since the year 2000. OPEC had spent 2025 aggressively unwinding 2.2 million barrels per day in voluntary production cuts, pushing the market into oversupply. In December of 2025, WTI settled at $57.42, down 20% on the year. Those inventory cushions bought some time when the conflict hit, but they also mean the cartel entered this crisis having already reduced much of its political leverage by chasing market share in an oversupplied market. And OPEC's institutional position in 2026 is not what it was in 1979. The UAE withdrew from OPEC on May 1st of this year. The Brookings Institution has stated OPEC is likely to have a less prominent position in oil markets and oil prices in the future. In 1979, the cartel was fractured between Saudi Arabia and Iran's price hawks, but it remained intact. The 2026 crisis is occurring while the organization is undergoing structural fragmentation in real time. Here is where things stand as of this week. The Strait of Hormuz is partially open. Transit volumes are at approximately 32% of normal levels. About 4.8 million barrels per day are moving through, compared to roughly 17 to 21 million before the conflict. United States and Iran's ceasefire negotiations are ongoing in Bergenstock, Switzerland. A 60-day memorandum of understanding exists but has not been finalized. Brent averaged roughly $107 per barrel in May and has pulled back toward the mid-90s in late June as ceasefire signals emerged. The EIA projects oil prices declining toward $89 by the fourth quarter of 2026 if strait flows gradually resume, but also projects OECD inventories falling to their lowest level since 2003 by December. EIA Administrator Tristan Abbey said this month that any scenario involving full restoration of inventories, production, and trade flows to pre-conflict levels must account for the partial restructuring of the global oil market that has already occurred. What 1979 actually tells us is not that this ends badly or that it ends well. It tells us that when OPEC's institutional machinery gets overtaken by a geopolitical event it did not engineer and cannot control, the policy announcements become theater. The real resolution comes from outside the cartel, from demand destruction, from supply built elsewhere, from years of economic adjustment. In 1979, that process took the better part of a decade and cut OPEC's market share by nearly half. Whether that becomes the pattern for 2026 depends on something the historical record cannot settle. Whether the strait reopens this year, or whether it does not. If flows resume substantially in the third quarter, as the EIA is projecting, the recovery timeline compresses. If they do not, if what looks like a ceasefire dissolves or the partial reopening becomes the new permanent state, then the 2026 disruption moves further from 1979 as a reference point and into territory for which there is no precedent. The IEA called it the greatest global energy security challenge in history, not the same as 1979, larger. The world spent the better part of the last century building an energy system with one assumption built into its architecture: the Strait of Hormuz stays open. As of today, it mostly does not.